started. I'll start off with the statement of acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge this land that we meet on today as the traditional lands of the Kaurna people that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. Item 2 is the attendance record, roll call. Everybody's here with no apologies, no motions to grant leave of absence, no leave of absence, and no non-attendance. Item 3 is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest for the meeting? No, none noted. And item 4 is business arising from the minutes. So we've got them. There's none. Yeah. So, all right. So we'll go straight to item 5, which for the decision reports, which is the 23-24 draft budget, with the 3 attachments. Sharon, would you like to talk to this?
Thank you. Through the chair, so thank you. So obviously the point of the purpose for tonight's meeting is for the draft budget that has been considered by the council and supported in principle be presented to the audit committee for their comment and feedback in relation to what is being presented. From this point depending on the feedback that's actually been provided by the audit committee or audit and risk committee, the draft budget and the annual business plan is being presented to the council at the April ordinary council meeting for the purposes of public consultation. So that's, and pretty much the report that's been presented is the report that was considered by the council at a special council meeting that was held on the 4th of April. During that process, the council went through obviously the operating initiatives and the capital projects to determine where there could be some savings or some reductions in the projects that are being considered for inclusion in the annual business plan for this for 23-24. What has been provided to the audit committee is basically the information that was a result of those discussions. I would sit there and say that the council has deliberated and considered the budget quite extensively. We've had 3 workshops with the council prior to the special council meeting, and we did have a long council meeting, a special council meeting, considering all the elements. So I think that the report that was presented as part of the agenda is fairly self-explanatory and covers all the elements. Obviously, it is reporting at this point in time a operating deficit, which was from the adopted long-term financial plan that was considered back in August 22, which was basically a position of operating deficits for the next couple of years. However, the operating deficit is probably a bit higher than what was anticipated, obviously because the economic situation has deteriorated with high inflation and still the supply chain issues and some economic unrest that is impacting us here with regard to the cost of our imports and supply. Which again, I suppose is making some tough decisions, especially with regard to what is an appropriate rate revenue increase to actually incorporate in this budget. As stated in the budget at current point, the budget is based on a CPI forecast of 6.5%. Obviously, I think the CPI for March comes out on the 26th of April. So obviously we'll be in a better position to determine if that 6.5% CPI figure is still around the mark for Adelaide. plus a element of new revenues from new development growth. So that's what the rate revenue increase is. At this point in time, because of the nature of the council area and the extent of growth, the initial valuation data that we actually received still had a lot of vacant properties listed in their data. And when we've actually gone through a bit of a QA of that review, we found that there's probably a lot of those that needed to actually change in land use because the development had either finished, so they were probably residential. So I'm probably not really in a position to sort of do the calculations because I'm not sure how many residential properties we actually have and what that increase is at this point in time. So I'm a bit hesitant to sort of sit there and say, okay, well, this translates to a particular rate increase. However, initial modelling based on some assumptions as to how many additional residential properties that we will have this year sort of indicates that probably the average rate for residentials will probably be between around about the $100 mark. But again, that's just a very basic modelling, not necessarily going through all the modelling with all the other elements that take into account in the model. But again, hopefully that in the next round of valuation data that we actually get, that those adjustments are actually made. So we will be in a position to have a better understanding of what that particular rate revenue or various other options with rate revenue increases will actually mean from an increase in the rates payable by the community. However, we're still seeing from a valuation perspective, still high property valuation growth. So I think the residential property values is still around, on average, around 15%. So we do have still some strong growth in property values in the Gawler East area, which has been tempered by some of the lower valuation growth in the rural zones. And the other factor is that commercial properties have actually have pretty much their valuations have bounced back since COVID, where we were seeing little or no growth in that commercial area, but we're getting 20-25% valuation growth in that commercial. So obviously that valuation growth will actually have an impact on that commercial sector. One of the other things that I've basically provided tonight is a copy of the analysis that I've undertaken with respect to the draft budget as presented in the report and its impact on the long-term financial plan. Ideally, I would have liked to have included this in the report. However, time was against me from that perspective, because we had pretty much a quick turnaround from the council meeting to getting this agenda out. Also in that analysis, I've actually undertaken, I just undertook one scenario with what potentially an additional rate revenue increase of 0.75% would actually have on the forward estimates going forward. And then a couple of other items that I've actually incorporated in that scenario. Currently, we provide 2 discretionary rebates to commercial properties, which have been in place for a significant period of time, which I think is probably, so it has been around 10 years, so it's probably subject to review as to whether, and on the surface, I would sit there and say that the considerations or the criteria or the position that they were in which the discretionary rebate was granted probably no longer exists, so it is probably subject to review. Those values is around about $85,000. That's not incorporated into the base budget. However, I've incorporated the removal of those discretionary rebates into the scenario 1. And then I'm just thinking, just my gut feel, considering the economic position, a lot of the natural disasters and the flooding, that the federal government may reinstate the supplementary road funding to South Australia, which currently is not included in the budget because there's no indication yet to say that that would actually be reinstated, because that was actually due to be finished for 22-23. So that's around about another 160,000. So, and then just made some adjustments to some of those increases in relation to the forward estimates. The long-term financial plan review is still based on the assumptions that were considered as part of the adopted long-term financial plan that was back in August 22. Other than those, so some of those changes. I'll just also point out though, this is actually basically a business as usual, but long-term financial plan. So there hasn't been included any of some of the major strategic projects that the council have been thinking about doing in the future. So that obviously there's talk about the swimming centre redevelopment, there's Carbeatham Reserve, and there's a couple of other big things as well. So I just probably wanted to present it as to sit there and say, this is the position for us doing, continuing on doing our normal operations from a recurrent perspective and delivering on our asset management plans, which have been adopted, which also incorporates some new investment. So it isn't the asset management plans or the funding in the asset management plans don't just consider the renewal component. There is some new infrastructure builds, but it's more in relation to footpath roads and that. So I just thought I'd provide that for information for your consideration when you're thinking about what feedback to provide or options that the council may consider when considering the budget again at the April meeting. And I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Councillor Koch.
Sharon, through the chair, Sharon. So the 7.25, so that's 6.5, that's the CPI, plus the 0.75 that you want to add. And it says the new growth as well. So what will it be actually?
Through the chair. So we're forecasting new development growth to be around about 1.5%. So that would bring it up to 8.75 under scenario 1. But currently it's 8% rate revenue.
Will we be adjusted? So we won't be adjusting the rate in the dollar if the valuations go up more than we think, or not?
Yeah, right, through the chair. Rate in the dollar, the rate in the dollar will come down. So effectively that's just by virtue of the model of valuation. So the rate increase that each ratepayer will pay is a combination of the change in their property values plus the rate revenue increase. So while we will have, because of that new development growth, which is new assessments, the 8% rate revenue doesn't automatically translate into a 8% increase. If you bear with me, I think the rate in the dollar so the rate in the dollar on my initial back of the envelope calculations will drop down to 0.0043, which in the last year it was about 0.46. Yeah, so it will take into the model actually also takes that, because obviously we are saying this is how much revenue we want to raise, and the only way we'll do that is by adjusting the rate and dollar down. Yep.
If we go to scenario 1, we sort of stay within our net liabilities ratio. Yeah, I think, and I suppose The big one, that's about scenario one, that's about the 0.75, is that right? So I didn't realise that we were going to have a net liability ratio of 120% in 2029. Was that, am I reading that right, that we did have that, or was that different?
So it's probably changed since the last time we saw it, because effectively the base year has actually changed. So this is actually driving. So this is driving off the base position off of where we were at for 23-24. So as a base position, where I suspect that obviously I wasn't across the long-term financial plan, and I'm not quite sure whether the long-term financial plan base year was 22-23 or whether it was 21-22, because that's where the current time frame of that is. So any increases, so obviously any change in the debt position and all that sort of stuff is actually reflected in these base figures. So yeah.
I suppose the other surprising thing is, if we don't go with scenario one, our debt level gets up to over 35 million, which is more than what our debt ceiling is, I think, anyway. So were we looking at increasing our debt ceiling with the finance people or not? Our borrowing capacity?
Through the chair. So the borrowing capacity will naturally increase, because obviously over that time our rate revenue will increase as well. So if you actually look at that period where it's around 35 million, so our rate revenue is actually gone from 29 million up to around forecast up to around about 42 million. So naturally, because our rate revenue will increase based on these rate revenue increases that were in the long-term financial. So we're not restricted at this point in time to the 25 million. So we will have extra capacity that we can actually go back and ask for additional borrowings, because our rate revenues and our operating revenue increases.
Question is, although that's okay, I've realised that I looked at the rate revenue, but our net financial liability, when our debt is 35 million, the financial liabilities ratio is well over 100%, which is outside of our policy settings. So I'm just concerned if we're starting to push up our borrowing capacity, that we're not bringing down that liability ratio. We're just seem to be borrowing and going over our 100%. Any comments there?
Yes, I agree with you. And that is, and I suppose that is actually a concern in relation to that. However, realistically, based on, I suppose, the asset management plan and the current indexation, which is reasonable indexation. So it pretty much says that, probably following on the advice from all the economists out there and listening to everything, that, you know, the plan is to sort of come back into normal inflation levels around 25, 26, 26, 27. So the model reflects that reduction in the inflationary impacts, going back down towards around about the 2.5–3%. It's just a question on the fact that it's the multiple impact of where we're at, and also the fact that we've got multiple years in the plan that is actually forecasting deficits. You know, so that is actually what's driving some of that that increase in the borrowings, is because effectively of that operating deficit, a lot of that is actually being driven from our normal operations. So effectively, we're having to borrow. We will have to borrow from a short-term CAD facility to actually meet those operational requirements going forward, based on, I suppose, based on these particular positions and all that sort of stuff, and these assumptions. Obviously, you know, if something changes with the assumptions, but they're pretty much to sit there and say, grant income has pretty much dried up now. You know, I think that during COVID, that period and all that sort of stuff, I think the federal and state government have probably pushed the envelope on giving those incomes and those grant funding out. It probably also had the double-edged sword, which was great at the time, but again, it increased, I suppose it increased from a council's perspective, increasing extra projects that probably weren't otherwise planned, because the requirement of that grant funding was that we had to bring forward projects that weren't in our long-term financial plan. So again, it's whether at that point in time we had the capacity, notwithstanding that was probably the right thing that as councils that we had to do. But again, and coupled that with a period where there was little or no or little rate revenue growth to actually fund all of that as well. It's that compounding impact in the future years, which is what we're actually seeing with that borrowing figure. So I don't think it's necessarily anything that the council has done per se. It's just been a matter of circumstances, and it's just a question on how as an organisation we can actually, I suppose, bring ourselves out of that, because it's because we do have this limited funding source, and increasing expectations from the community as well to deliver lots of things without increasing that revenue base. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, look, I'm equally concerned about the net financial liabilities ratio and also the bank overdraft. This doesn't take into account any refurbishment. That's all been removed from the long-term financial plan. So you really have to look at these figures and scratch your head and go, we're not actually reducing our borrowings, we're increasing our borrowings and increasing our financial liabilities ratios. So I think we need to really look long and hard at our financial indicators. Financial liabilities ratio should not go over 100%, quite frankly. It shouldn't be up to 120, and it's a little bit over 120 and 229. And we don't, Gawler does not have rich people. Let's just be honest here. 20% of our population go into payment plans to pay their rates. So, you know, a 7.25%, and I appreciate Sharon's words around COVID. That was because people were really struggling to pay their rates. And look, I don't know if we could have done anything different. However, it does impact, but I'm really keen to hear from the independent members on how we can change these figures. Now, without putting our rates up by 10%, it's going up by 8.75% with growth. And I think a few years ago, we had 3 lots. I think we had 4 lots of 8% rate rises. And it went from nothing up to 24%. So, and people really railed against that. There's only so much money people have, and I'm really cognizant of the capacity of our community to pay rates. And so, yeah, I'm interested to hear what the feedback is and what strategies we can put in place. Now, I know that staff have cut this budget by over $1 million because it was 2.6 million, I think, in deficit, and now it's 1.6. So that's an improvement, of course. But I think we need to go a little bit further, and I'm really keen to hear from all of the independent members. And it's not just about putting up rates by 10%. Or 8.75%, and I think that's going to be a hard sell, frankly. I think we have to be near that mark somewhere. I agree with Sharon, but we need to be quite ruthless in what we're spending our money on. And yeah, I'm really keen to hear what your opinions are on just how a holistic approach, not just a one-dimensional approach of rate rises, but what else do we need to do? That we might be able to improve some of these numbers, or is it a lost cause? I don't think it's a lost cause. I think there's always something you can do. So I'm really keen to hear because the council is grappling with what to take in and what to take out, and we didn't really succeed very successfully the other night. And we've got Councillor Davies observing here tonight, and I'm sure other members of council might be listening. So we're really keen to hear what your views are and the strategies that we could potentially employ to even improve some of these numbers slightly. So I'll hand it over to you to have a good listen.
Peter, just put your microphone on.
Yes, through you, Chair. I guess I was a little concerned when I saw the papers for the last few days, and it is a bit of a conundrum. First of all, just a general thing, I felt in the papers the absence of some point of reference to the previous long-term financial plan, because I really wanted to go back and see how did this compare with what we had last sort of predicted. I did find one that was, I thought maybe out of date, I don't know, but there's one like 21, 22 on the web, and that had a big deficit in the current financial year, and then it came down by $300,000 or $400,000 in the year we're now looking at. So things have changed dramatically in that time period, quite significantly. And so I don't think we're going to get to a 0 point with all this, but if we can get back to a point where we're seeing the deficit coming down earlier than is forecast, then that would be a big achievement. The other thing I thought I missed was in the documents was the comparatives with last year. Everything starts with the current year and goes forward just about, and there's very little comparison or analysis of comparison between what I see as the anchor for what we're considering now. And so I think in future, Sharon, if we can get these figures produced with the previous year. Sorry. Yes, but there's no comparison between those two things and the first few pages that deal with the budget. There's no reference point there either. So anyway, it's just I have a desire or preference to see, and I think it aids the analysis to be able to see that and explain the difference between what happened last year and what's happening this year. Having said that, I had first of all, a question around depreciation, which has gone up 11.6% on last year. And I know there's been a lot of cost increases there and there's some growth there, but have we got a clear idea why is that a reasonable increase? I mean, is there some basis for seeing that level of increase?
Through the chair. So obviously at the last, as part of the budget review too, we identified a potential area with regard to depreciation, which we have actually gone through some analysis, and that was actually being driven from the actual value revaluation of around about 46 million. So we have identified that there was probably a bit of a overvaluation or incorrect use of unit rates on particular classes of roads that had driven some of that increase. So we are expecting an adjustment of around about $9 million on our road assets, which predominantly relate to some of the, how we applied some of the unit rates and the different road structure associated with the Gawler East.
So you're saying that that is something that might come later. It's not actually reflected in the figures currently. Is that what you're saying?
No, I've reflected that in the figures. So basically that the $7.9 million that is considered for the base year for the budget is considered a reasonable depreciation charge based on our historical position, our capitalisation, and the impact of what this revaluation. I think with regard to depreciation in the current year, the forecast, I think that the forecast was probably a bit undercooked in for 22-23. So I'm probably expecting that the current year depreciation should probably be around about 7.3, 7.4. So it's around about $500,000 when you've got the impact of the gifted assets and all that sort of stuff as well. In doing the depreciation calculation and the estimate for what we actually think from a depreciation impact, it's always this unknown about the value of our gifted assets. And again, at what rate. We are going through a process of trying to determine that, because obviously from a development perspective, some of that development has slowed down. So it's a question of what rate that slowed down and what that transfer of that assets, those asset transfers are actually happening, which is always, it's always, if I had a crystal ball, as to what that value of that assets as well. So, and again, realistically, and again, it's that from a depreciation and from the valuation perspective, what us and all the other councils are grappling with, when we're doing those revaluations, is the impact of the change of the unit rate. Is that just an aberration because of the economic conditions? And so can we actually realistically take a discount those current rates, because we know that they're actually not going to continue on to the future. So we actually probably smooth some of that that increase in that the replacement cost of our asset base, rather than having a big spike and a big drop. So that's some of the things that we're still grappling with, and that will be part of a report that comes back to the audit committee at the May meeting, to sort of sit there and say, this is where we're at. This is where the position is, and these are the potential options that we have to actually address that particular issue. And this is what our recommended approach is. That depreciation, I suppose that depreciation charge is based on what our historical depreciation, based on our asset values, has actually been, and all that for want of the information that we actually have available. But again, it's still predicated on that we're getting $6 million worth of gifted assets that is going to add into our asset base, that we're actually going to have a revaluation, and what that revaluation and the impact of that revaluation of the asset base, and that we're going to, complete our capital works program and our new assets in line with how we've actually budgeted for them. So there's, for the methodology, I'm comfortable in the way it's been calculated. Do I have confidence in all the elements that are going to come through how I've made that assumption and in the model? Can't say that. I can't hand on my heart and sit there and say that, that it's going to come out that way.
Yeah, so is the revaluations, they're being done through independent or reference with independent advice?
And so we have actually gone out to independent to get the unit rate, and just to confirm the unit rate. So obviously, one of the things that we actually identified with regard to that, the extent of the revaluation for the 21-22 actuals was that from an internal perspective, we weren't indexing high enough. So that was some of the impact. So there is a bit of catch up there. This financial year, as part of 22-23, we are actually going through a condition assessment of all our civil infrastructure assets as well. So again, I suppose, so this is potentially the hard year that we actually take with regard to what our civil infrastructure assets, which predominantly are most of our assets are as well. So so we're going through those two processes as well. We have thought about whether about actually going out to someone else from a unit to make that assessment on the unit price as well, rather than the person that we've used that we use previously and all that sort of stuff, and get some, I suppose, some comparisons for where they would sit there and say from the unit rate is. And it is that question, and just determining from our current valuation, is that the high rate, low rate, mid-year rate, or is that the rate point in time, and is that necessarily an appropriate rate to actually determine at this point in time, given the current conditions that we're actually experienced with regard to supply of labour and materials and the inflationary impacts that it actually has on those input prices.
I mean, I'm focusing on depreciation because that's one of the big areas of quantum significance. So if anything can be done there, then that obviously would help. And I know we're caught with the CPI on wages. Who would have thought? But I don't know if there's any force majeure measures that can be to get out of that. But that sort of is it's a big impost, and probably would need to be reflected in future.
And that has had a huge impact from 22, 23 to 23. We've estimated 6.5%. Again, that is based on whatever the March CPI comes out at as well. So obviously there will be a potential pressure and all that sort of stuff. And I would be sort of recommending probably that we work out how we can absorb that somehow. We've already built in some level of savings in relation to that because of the time period to engage staff when we have turnover and all that sort of stuff as well. So we've already taken that up. So it's just a question on what other mechanisms or things that we can do to counteract a further potential increase that hasn't been accounted for.
I'll give Christine a go in a minute, but just one other quick comment really is we're basing on the Adelaide CPI measure, which for the 6.5. And I noticed that at the December quarter, the Adelaide CPI was running at 8.6%, which was highest nationally. And that was partly driven by the fact that housing costs in Adelaide had remained high, whereas in other states, particularly Sydney, Melbourne, so on, they've been reducing, so it had a downward effect on. I'm not sure that has changed significantly in the March quarter, so it may be that the Adelaide CPI will be higher than the national average, and I think the 6.5 is probably a national figure. But that's just a comment, but it needs to be, yeah. So just need to be aware of that.
Okay. Just a clarification one first on depreciation and asset revaluations. In the 2023 forecast that we've got here, it doesn't have an asset revaluation in there. The balance sheet shows no movement. So when the asset revaluation is booked for the 23 year, taking into account whether you're going to smooth or however you do it, that's going to result in an even higher depreciation charge. So this 2024 budget that we're looking at with a projected deficit of 1.6 million, when that depreciation charge goes up, budget revision number 1, all other things being equal, will that show an even bigger deficit?
I hope not. And again, I don't have a crystal ball. As I said, in relation to that 7.9, so I suppose while it's not budgeted for in calculating in what I'm thinking about as a impact on depreciation as that base position, I've actually taken that into account in determining that, even though it's not in the balance sheet and all that sort of stuff as well. So I've sort of done a off the books quick calculation based on, I suppose, my thoughts as to what a reasonable increase in that depreciation charge, having in mind of where we're at with our capital, the value of our capital works program, the extent of how many assets that we're going to receive and potential movements. Again, it's to sit there and say, I suppose my advice would be that I think we not necessarily take the actual point in time unit rates that we tend to. I think we should probably discount them because these are long-term assets, you know, and it's not as though we're going to be replacing, you know, $450 million worth of assets all at one point in time. So realistically, it's like, you know, at some point, you know, so why artificially inflate something when we're not using it? We don't sell a product where it's not a item for sale. There's no active market. Realistically, are we would we be materially misstating our financial position if we didn't actually take the full thing? I personally don't think so, because of the nature of the operations that we're actually in. I know that the accounting standards say, you know, this is it, but realistically, we're not a commercial, we're not selling, we're not determining prices based on that factor, because there's no open market anyway.
I mean, this is all book entries. We haven't started talking about cash yet, but maybe as an audit and risk committee, we can make some comment about depreciation methods and asset revaluations, and happy to hear proposals from administration on different ways the asset revaluations can be done. I mean, as I said, it's all book entries, but it'll help make the numbers look a bit better.
And ultimately, our decisions about investment are driven by cash, not necessarily the depreciation charge, which theoretically funds our asset renewal. You know, ultimately, it always comes back to cash and whether we have the cash capacity or financial capacity to replace the assets. And, you know, we're realistic in the sense that we're probably not in a position to actually do that at this point in time, from that perspective as well. So you're right, it's just a book entry. And however, notwithstanding that, is that we actually also need to make sure that we're still generating enough cash within the operations to actually fund our day-to-day operations, and then making that contribution to the renewal, so we're not having to borrow to actually also do that renewal as well. So it is a bit of a double-edged sword, but again, it's yeah.
So, Paul, have you got a
Unless you've got another depreciation one. Okay. I guess this is a clarification one. it talks about new developments, there's a transfer of assets from the property developers. And so now council has to pay for maintenance and street cleansing and playgrounds, so that increases an expense. But I'm just wondering, when that transfer happens, will you then get maximum rates from those properties, or let's say only half the street has houses and the other half are still empty blocks? So are you having to take on 100% of the street cleaning and playgrounds and all of that before you're earning maximum rates? I'm looking for a positive in future years, maybe, if there's an improvement.
Yeah, you probably, so I think obviously, depending on where the area is to sit there and say, but you would sit there and say, there is a bit of a lag between when the full housing stock is there compared to when, you know, obviously if half the street's there, we have to do a road. So that means we have to, you know, provide services to that half a road. We will put the playground in. So, you know, depending on the timing of when that the rate of that development. So, you know, we will have to go in there and potentially maintaining the playgrounds and all that sort of stuff. And obviously, you know, the council did a tour of some of those new developments, and, you know, and as with all new developments, they're prepared and they're built at a high standard, which effectively also impacts our ability to, or the costs that we incur once we actually take them over, to actually maintain them at that standard as well. So, but yes, going forward, you would actually get, so there's a lag of the revenue, but then over time it should catch up.
It's working, yes. So that's what I was thinking, that if the growth starts to taper off, so you start to catch up on that lag, then I was expecting to see some improvement in the operating ratio. Whereas if you're growing forever, you're always going to have that lag. And so it's going to be hard to catch up.
I think realistically over the next 10-year time frame, it is going to be growing, especially when you've got Concordia and some of the other developments. Like obviously maybe over a 50-year period, but over this planning period of 10 years, we will have that continuing growth and more things coming on, and a lag between when the full, I suppose, the full impact of all that rate revenue comes through. Yeah, so I think that's the issue, is maybe over a 50-year time frame, but you know, as a growth council, and what we know that's actually coming as well over the next you know, next 20-25 years as well, I don't think that there will be a position of catching up.
I note that the council is tendering out their horticultural services. I've been through the tender. It looks quite all-encompassing. If and when those services are contracted out, will there be any material impact on the budget?
Through the chair, I'm honestly not in the position to answer that question. I would work on the presumption that effectively any savings that are coming out of that tender, because it's actually been planned and we're going through the budget cycle, that they would have actually been taken into account. And I don't know why we're tendering out the horticultural services, because I'm not obviously close enough to that as to whether that we're tendering out the horticultural services to actually deal with the increased growth of maintenance that's required because of some of that development growth. I'm not across that to answer that, but
Question: is there we talked about when we take on new development, developers actually put their horticultural open space at higher standards. Is there an opportunity for us to actually to rationalise the standard? It's actually, so it's more economical for us to, more sustainable for us to manage.
Through the chair, a number of years ago, we did quite a bit of work on our open space standards, and that's been implemented, and it has reduced what was traditionally quite high standards to, I think, what is now relatively modest standards. In that, you know, initial design concept plans for open space are critiqued from a design perspective, from a maintenance perspective. So, you know, we have done work in that space. I'm sure there's still room for further rationalisation and standardisation relative to the new Gawler and the old Gawler. But that certainly is a current important focus.
My questions. Just wanted to unpack with the asset renewal funding ratio or the asset sustainability ratio. There's, you know, from 2023 to 2024, there's a big dip. I'm just having a look on page 3. On the bottom there. Is that because, and I was just sort of reconciling that to the 23-24 initiatives that you've said that council went through. Is that to do, the ratio dropped because, you know, because it's outside the train tracks there? Is that because the projects to, you know, renew assets have been dropped, or what's the main driver of that decrease?
I think it's a consciousness of the fact that effectively we're from a financial capacity perspective, in the sense that the long-term financial, the asset management plans that were renewed back in, when were they done? Last year, was it last year? And all that sort of stuff worked, was based on a particular level. And I think when the engineering staff went through and developed their proposals for the 23-24, I think that they basically sort of thought, yeah, we would love to do all this sort of stuff, but we know we don't, we don't have the financial capacity of it, but also at this point in time with the engineering team, because in that space, it's actually, you know, the team is under-resourced at the moment. We are having difficulties actually filling people in that space. So I think it's just more of a realistic position of this is what our capacity to do. While it's also, I'll just add, while I acknowledge that the fact is actually under the train tracks, I think that that's where one of the things about the asset, you know, as long as from a rolling perspective, it's within those train tracks. And from memory, I think it's around about 90%. It's sort of like at the lower end, and all that sort of stuff over the last that rolling 3-year average. So I think that that's probably a better indicator to sort of sit there and say, are we creating a backlog by taking this approach? Because of that rolling average, that sort of allows for those peaks and troughs to determine that we're not necessarily creating a backlog against our asset management plan.
No, I was just worried that, you know, that had been considered, because you don't want the backlog in future years when we're looking so tight, and then you've got, you know, assets failing because they haven't been adequately maintained.
And I'll just add, and I think that and from memory, if you actually look at the class of assets, from an civil infrastructure perspective, that's pretty much around the mark. So it's probably more in the open space area where, in the past we've done a lot of stuff. So it's sort of just sitting there saying, okay, well this year, considering what we've done in the previous years, we just basically have a bit of a rest. From that,
that's fine.
From that perspective.
Yep. The other question I have, so sort of reviewing it to sort of see what levers could be pulled, and there's not many levers that can be pulled. And I suppose it comes back to the initiatives, and so a bit more about the selection of the projects from council. You said that that had been brought down in the council meetings. Do you believe that there's any more, not trying to use my words the right way, are there any more projects that are non-essential that, you know, that could reduce the project expenditure?
From a staffing perspective, we've had lots of discussions and lots of hard discussions regarding the operating initiatives, because obviously it's the operating initiatives. There's probably 3 or 4 key things in there that we think are essential. Obviously, the stuff that is focusing on, I suppose, the growth aspects in relation to the growth framework, the integrated transport study, the rural codes amendment, boundary reform. We think that, you know, which pretty much make up the bulk of that spend. From a staffing perspective, we think for the future of the council that they are non-negotiables from that perspective as well. So, but that's, yeah, because we think that without doing some of that preliminary work, knowing what's actually happening from a growth perspective, and to actually make sure that we're addressing some of those pressures, that work is essential. And once you take those things out, there's not a lot left from memory, from that perspective as well. So yeah, so if you ask staff, we would sit there and say no. And I think considering the arduous night that we had the other night from an elected member's perspective going through them, I don't think that elected members are probably seeing that there's anything unnecessary in there, and all that sort of stuff as well. So as from a critical service delivery perspective, to position ourselves going forward.
I think that's a fair summary of the meeting that we had the other night. There's not a lot in the initiatives. If you take out the Gawler and District's netball court redevelopment, which was externally funded by 4.8 million, that changes things quite substantially. However, you can't do that because that was a state government commitment, election commitment. So, and I know that the Netball Association is very much looking forward to that. So, you know, what do you do when you're given a really generous amount of money to be able to improve something that hasn't been improved since it was built?
Yeah.
So I think that there's not a lot of movement that can be achieved in the initiatives. I agree completely. And I think that reflects very well the discussion we had the other night. We focus more on capital projects. There aren't a lot of projects in this document. There's some essential work. There's some really strategic work. For example, the growth framework is vitally important. The integrated transport plan is also really, really important. Boundary reform is, I believe, essential. The Bullaston Cemetery Conservation Management Plan, there's not a lot here. There's a review of the Disability Access and Inclusion Plan. There's not a lot. Rural Zone Code Amendment, that's been a long time coming, and I think if we took that out, there'd be a full-scale riot across the rural areas. So we're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place in a real sense. But yeah, it is a challenge because we're a growth council and our growth is not going to stop. It won't stop. So yeah, you really need to have a long-term vision of where council should be in the next 20 years. And that's where this growth this growth framework and the integrated transport plan might help us understand what that vision might look like.
And I suppose the other lever is the rates. What have you heard other councils are doing, like sort of with as far as rate increases go, what seems to be the way people are going?
They're high.
They're all
They're, you know, Onkaparinga came out with 8.6%, plus they have a fixed charge, so that's a massive increase. Pretty much what I've been hearing is most of them at a minimum are going, having a punt on CPI plus growth. I know that, even Nord Council, where I heard that they were going 8% plus growth, and I'm sitting there going, hey. Make sure you put a submission in. I don't know. That's because your property went up so much. We capped it. So, you know, so most of the councils are going probably around I would be saying around an 8%, between that 7.5%, 8% inclusive of growth. It's really hard. I always find it interesting when I ask that question of my colleagues in other councils, because it's a question on the message that they want to get across as to how they actually say what their rate increase is or rate revenue increase is going to be. So, but I've pretty much heard most of them are around 8 or CPI plus growth.
Point. We've spoken a lot about rate revenue growth, but that doesn't necessarily correlate, you know, of 8%. That doesn't correlate to what that means for the rate adjustment of your average valuation. And so, Sharon, can you just talk about that distinction? Because in the documentation we presented to council, I think there was a figure of 3.7% in terms of real terms relative to what it means for, you know, the average valuation, average property. Can you just talk about that as a distinction in terms of rate revenue?
So basically the rate, I suppose from a rate, the rate's payable. There's a whole heap of factors that take into account of what the increase is going to be. So normally what happens is with regard to, obviously we have a normal increase in property values. So what we actually do then is adjust our rate per dollar to actually work out how much of a rate increase that is going to be. What that means for the average ratepayer takes into account how much the property market has moved. You know, normally if you actually unpack that increase, you would sit there and find that you know, that normally you would have a rate payable increase as a result of valuation change being far in excess of around about 200, you know, say 250.
Property, and then because we actually changed the rate, we actually bring that up down to dollars. So we reduce the rate in dollars to bring that back to working of revenue. Yeah, but equally that, and then I think that there might be a slight calculation error, so I think it would have to be normally 8 would be higher than that. So I expect that, as I said, I think it's probably going to be about and because we're looking at 6 months. The commercial, I come from this what comes to residential property, but then here in the West House, we actually growth in that commercial sector as well. normally, what you actually find is that, if there's normally the resident area is about a third of the property will probably be within, their rates because their property hasn't moved in the same way as, what the average is. You have about a third of the property sort of sitting around what the average rate is, and then but yeah, so it is one of those things that are actually not difficult, but it will be less than 100%, because we've got ways of growth as well in the commission. Normally, so it's getting good as she feels the revenue collection coming from the revenue. It doesn't, when you say 8% over revenue, it doesn't automatically, and it's normally, a lot less, because it's one, your normal organic valuation growth, which should actually be used. And I think that that's one of the challenges that as well for this year is the new investment growth could actually really come on. So I think the figures that I saw last year was probably about 56 new investments, which is a massive number of new investments coming in, whereas you're not going to get any more this year. So which also sort of said when you have a year where you want to increase your revenue bad, but you're not actually getting that from most investments that it's really plus. You've actually been getting the revenue growth that you want from those new assessments. We're not sort of saying that evaluation figures and from payments. Okay. But again, as I say, it's considered and for us, we can actually go on and still the end business plan, is making sure that we're still selling properties and selling selling all things that different parts that we get another time. Where, as I said, we're not new, to everyone else that's out there in the community, we still have to buy things from suppliers who are getting impacted by rate increases and input price increases and that sort of stuff. And unfortunately, we don't have one government source. And the taxation rate is different. So yeah, and I don't have the answer, and I'm not easy quick fix. And probably that question. If that's sustainable to yeah, we'll take it to 10. You're going to live with 10. What roles of the government is to be mentioned? So, what you're saying, Sharon, and what I'm hearing from you is no easy fix. There's just one solution, which is quite preference. I think that that's going to be very important in this community. However, the bottom line is we have the information system. And price will work from there. Does in order to complete the things, you hide it. We don't know what CPI will do. We could have projected this, but here it is, so we have to manage it. The bottom line is we have to do and if that's threatened, then this council, you know, will be put into administration. And that's happening, you know, that's happening in Shimon. They're going to be administrated from Darren.
Teams are only been at the time because of their financial connection. Yeah. The Darren has got some, not on an interest, some in management going. So if you're not careful in that,
We have to be connections, that's one of my connections, and what does that look like? And unfortunately, we're going to get a plan because you can't have situations where you're not financially well, they have an extraordinary issue that not easy to resolve. We don't have an issue here. We are a large council, and unfortunately, you don't get the children's back to everybody. You have to do this stuff, and you're subjected to growth. You have to manage that everybody in the council. And our initiatives are very simple. And you know, projects, which I appreciate very much. So I think that, you know, we are being very lean. We need to be able to indicators to ensure that they come back. They come back into the green. Yes. Very important to deliver the next one for the state of funding is to deliver. Continue say getting additional funding. Especially when people believe that you can fall. Are there any areas that would provide, you know, service levels require? Do you think over the years you can see the growth council you've got the big up, you know, if you think outside, you know, sometimes, you know, different innovation, is there other areas that, you know, the areas might be overserved or is it that it's not rich, you know, when you need to expectations, are there, you know, services that you can reduce or the easily that you can pull your expenses, not projects, but there's delivering council services, whether it's contracts or anything like that, there might be potential savings, you know.
But there's always room for improvement, particular focus at the moment is the service, the outdoor service team. We're expecting, quite a big delay in that analysis, that's now back on track, and we are expecting a report on that review for the end of June. And that will set the framework or the foundations for change in service level and resources, insourcing output model. And to the extent that the framework the model for the next 5 to 10 years. So that won't inform the budget at this point, but leading into the financial year following, it could do, but we haven't yet received the report of the thorough analysis, and that's a particular focus at the moment. We just know that our resources that are coming can't having exponential growth, particularly in our green spaces. We are getting some external eyes and ears, taking out the passion and the potential biases, and see what is best practice.
When is the enterprise 5 million agreement on the another 3 years or whatever?
2024, June 2024.
So we have an opportunity to adjust, not having that CPI, but actually have a reasonable increase. That might some people get a issue around that 3%.
Well, yes, that would be the intent as we lead into those negotiations. Mindful that the negotiations were protracted and difficult at the time when they started, because we were talking about CPI 1.5. But yeah, certainly making sure there's a lower cap in that.
If you do have that challenge, that's
Yes, certainly. It's rather exceptional that people are getting service. It's important, I think. The better methods. And it's of course make cash balance. So probably this year we're saying that they go to the work around choice. We simply talk about growth as a bad thing. My experience has always been in terms of improving on this scale. And some questions, the very steady factors, yes, and difficult on to difficult revenue on that growth, but have why it was needed very so in terms of how you want to go from here, and make suggestions, I guess, one question I have is in relation to the issues that have been mentioned in this secondary evaluation, was about growth rates, and you mentioned that maybe when will we know make budget? Is there any members going? Yes.
I haven't read anything. I'm just going by a view of that it's a movement now, and the vision and the level of infrastructure then probably simply required due to the funding and the last comment of that is the work that has to be time that the management as well, so that's where, just one of you, I'm not very, but,
So the other thing you had there was this the rebate issue. Explain any more detail of how.
well, I think for one of them, I think the obviously in the sense that definitely like person for one representation for one recipient that the conditions that the reevaluation before, which was establishing goals and how we use and establishing goals and established within the community and I don't believe that they probably need to anymore. So that the other one's probably a bit more problematic. I think one, you know, voting, and because that's you know that 40 years is contacting impact as well. So again, it's my recommendation would be not to, because I don't necessarily believe that where in kind of that it was and realistically you should be doing quite regularly to make sure that the conditions I don't know. That is my decision. Just about say yes. But again, it's not necessarily and all that sort of stuff that come into it. Yeah.
The third one, it's clear, identify that you might know. What is the matter? The other one is to click the.
I mean, one may be easier, one may be harder, which is must be taken place. One is that even something like that is sounds like it will be a towards the objective. Just kind of the netball where it's not on the land, so that's
So there's a combination of that. So you have to think about in the end, it is basically it's got a zero impact in the financials. We've got the 4.4 rather than offset the expense. Its components, so the component of it is essentially on our land, effectively but effectively it doesn't help because it's fully funded, so it's not it removes some of the expense to capital, remove some of the income as well because it's actually delivering from a national perspective. So that won't help. That's going to artificially inflate the result, which basically doesn't. It might make this year's number a bit more colourful, but it's not impacting the future year because it's actually one. It's actually one thing as well. Yeah, so that's from my perspective. So And I was doing that effectively that they were fulfilled and that we will see full support allocation, whether it's a combination of advance and yeah. Yeah, that will come into the main meeting. For the everything else that's incorporated in the budget or pretty much. I just think everything what comes through the initial and so that kind of movement. What increase definitely or increase you we know that the new development. There is a new thing about is coming that we look at.
The growth is good, but when you're dealing with an old town environment, the old town is much up. So we're 30 years behind progress, and I think that reflects a traditional approach 10 years ago when you grades, all of those factors come into play. So when you're dealing with an old, very old town, to the generation, and a brand new development, there's tension. There's absolutely, it's not more than like scenario. It's brand new. It's the tension. So you have to balance that what you see in the traditional areas. How you invest in footpaths, you know, how to get them up to scratch. Visibility access, old town, it's no easy task. There was a complaint by somebody in Cold Street, we were upgrading, become more disability compliant, which is a complete, and is complaining about that. Even though it would improve the accessibility of that particular street. So it is a tension that you have to manage very carefully. And we have really spent quite a number of initiatives in our existing plan, so that we alleviate that tension. Yeah, and I think that's been good work. Yeah, it's been really good work. There's a lot of opportunity going forward to bring the two communities together. There's a lot of issues that we can employ in a cheap way. One is a new e-newsletter, which I think will encourage all the citizens of our community, and that will help bring people together. So yeah, it is attention. When you're doing an old town, brand new developments, and also developments on our doorstep, which is probably a 10,000 growth within 300 homes. And that could be bigger. And then you've got these developments that are just not county, and people generally gravitate and use the service and support, which is great in other councils, not so great. And so, you need to manage that as well. And that's a tricky one, because there's no capacity to charge people more. It's always you pay whatever it is, and it is that will be quite a challenge going forward, particularly for Formula, which could be 25 to 30,000 people, which is double our population, less than a kilometre from our main street. So it absolutely stands to reason that people will consider more people and use all of the services. They'll shop and do a lot of business and all, which is great for business. And that's the good part of it. But the challenge is how we manage those people and how we actually encourage, well, boundary reform would assist with that. So I think that there's lots of challenges for them, particularly around growth, particularly in other council areas on the store. And that's just the environment that we're in, and we need to manage that very carefully. And I think that I personally think we could join consider boundary reform, we will be challenged quite substantially going forward.
You mentioned states, people's states wasn't. Any other comment? Yeah. Is that is that bring something to the table and can be a productive exercise.
The chair, yes, well, every line is being scrutinised, but you're right, you can always go back and you can always push harder. And given the summary, that's what we'll be doing.
Couple of questions. Talked a lot about rates as a source of income. Just wondering if there's any opportunities or considerations being given to increase non-rate income. And I know some of it is dependent on state, federal, the rest of it, but I'm just wondering, user charges, as an example, the opportunity to increase the non-rate income.
Most would be user charges, income rate rates that have probably gone up greater than, I suppose, the 3.5% that we sort of gave in the guideline, because of truth that, I suppose, some of the increase in operating costs as well, so some of the areas have already, where you've got a volume, that's actually going to make a difference. Yeah, people charges are greater than 3.5%, but you might be using that fee, or it's such a minor component of the total. There is probably not necessarily capacity, but I know that we're doing bigger charges before and looking at areas which most from the sports centre and the rec centre and that sort of stuff and community centre, their fees, by range, you have that for. And again, you've still got, I suppose it's still got that, the those things for the services that we actually, provide, volume, so what's the point? What's the point realistically? So yeah, so some of the areas are, again, essentially if there, you know, there might be some other areas where you might, you know, out in the registration, really do some things to making sure that, you know, we're getting out and registration, however, the introduction of data code has been one tool that has basically we've had to upload in the registration because it's harder to sort of avoid and obviously the other tickets and all that sort of stuff and then extra capacity in you know, doing that and was the parking tickets and warnings and see the price and areas from a parking perspective that you want that over. Yeah, so I suppose then probably two easy ones that you can probably maybe get a bit of market stock volume that will have to generate that. Yeah, it is all volume dependent, obviously, leaves and that sort of stuff coming over, but that's what's coming off because that's the rate of development. And also even there's the impression there, you know, it is that balance, you know, between making sure that you're still getting many of those so yeah, so we can in the third goal, like what it is. I don't know how much extra capacity there is to grow the one even further. Other than kind of get a volume perspective of more. Do you really I'm student and have come up with that's just like the motivation. So it's really that and you might necessarily charge a laser for them. Yeah, so you know, having the maintenance associated with those.
Any other business that do
Yes, so I'm aware that they vision to the cost of the ground maintenance of and
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that it's not a full fossil cover. If that. Doing so,
I think it's something. But anyway, we want them to engage in and manage that. Do need to have reasonable cost. And it is quite cheap, about $7. Which is very cheap. Very cheap. But if you go to the local cost, 15 or 20. I thought it was different. Yeah, it's between 15 and so a lot of people need to be supported, but it's up to everyone to do wow, yeah, it is cheap. Yeah, you have to know
everyone else, what these are, and what could be done, so I guess the question more around, administration review that area, they satisfied that they're maximising opportunities whilst balancing the community. Another question, my community member had on down at the consultation. One of the questions I would ask is for you. The number I calculated by 11%. The budget parameter on page 6 is 11.85% increase. So I think some of that difference is new positions after we're budgeting 3.5 new positions. It's about 290,000. But those new positions don't explain fully the difference between the 7.85% budget parameter and the 11% increase. So I feel there's an explanation for it, but I'm just suggesting that maybe, on screen. I think they said question.
Just your information is different, realistically for that comparison with the budget review. Whereas effectively and we as the budget review goes through, we will take up. So, however, in preparing budget, we work on we have discounted that budget by knowing that it will be turned over during the year, and we know that. I think that rather than what actual there that probably that's really in time being growing on a full establishment, and we actually think that very announcing to community members and maybe appointing employees cheaper than using.
you're right about that, however, sometimes you can get you can't get the employee that, effectively that completes himself and I suppose the fifth organisation, which is where the difficulty actually. But we're cognizant of the fact that it's going to be undertakes on the ground to actually do the work.
I'm given the style of the budget and the debt we've got going forward. What would happen if, say, an initiative came up with say $5 million? What would happen with that? That there is one on the in the office.
My recommendation would be as where that initiative can fund external, we should really consider whether we do that. And if we do say that if the potential that we need to work out what we're not doing to do that initiative, would be my advice to the chamber. We have a more question, comment.
Oh, yes.
Okay. So we have a recommendation that the audit committee recommends to council that the draft 2023 budget set out in finance and budget statement containing special money against all in principle, that the community engagement with the draft the report annual plan. Sorry, Chair. Depreciation and just getting that depreciation figure down, which contributes. Agree with stopping the rebate. Looking at fees and charges and reviewing fees and charges and seeing that they're appropriate for the community, for our community to manage, but also the legal service that we provide. We talked about the various brains around the depot and the review and looking at service reviews. So workforce and service review should be ongoing. We had a discussion around the rate rise and the gender equality. Are we agreeing with the scenario I like, or are we agreeing with the So in scenario one, it's 7.25, which is 8.75 plus new development.
7.25, I feel doing.
Just put it like you know.
Yes, which equates to 8.25.
Yeah, I'll put that down, but I mean, otherwise, if you look at these things, you don't, we're at 35 million. You think one.
Well, I guess is that a consensus you is only asking us to endorse the 2024 budget. We're not talking about future years. That's right. Are we wanting to change the rate line, or are we accepting what's on the draft? The third option. If the match CPI is different from the assumptions in here, that assumption should be okay. The guy understands, so effectively the recommendation would be that the revenue increase would be based on the March CPI rate or 6.5%, whichever is higher. Because you might actually not personally, I don't think so. That's good to. Aim to we probably need to change that slightly vehicles invisible. Incorporating an aim to reduce the deficit from the premium. Or an aspirational, whatever we aspirational. I think it's other ones that are high that considered, they into the bid, not everything. But I think, use
the embedded business plan is. I think that we probably need to take, that the draft budget set out financial statement with a consideration of a reduction in the operating deficit to by 300,000. And taking because effectively what is the or consideration of reduction of operating contained 300,000.
Yeah, but I'm happy to go back to the executive team and see what we can first squeeze. Whether we might help both the council and the community to then see that, and if we were to something to the effect that such areas actually, such areas to be considered as follows, relative to what was, so we mentioned appreciation, rebates, fees and charges review, the workforce service reviews, and we talked about that they will remain. I think if we itemise those as elements to be further considered, but not limited to, then and sorry, Peter's comment about further critiquing the budget to achieve those 1 to 2% savings throughout. I think that sort of quantifies the elements of the conversation.
So, but you should ask of next to the president. And then we have to ask them areas to consider when things that what we.
Yeah.
Is that what I'm saying? Appreciate.
Review.
It's very, yeah. Even, service level and workforce and right.
Yes. The injury has been provided that I don't think meaning, meaning, very possible. Put it in I suggest that maybe another recommendation, in consideration of the comprehensive, comprehensive review of the long-term financial plan. In there, sit down and have the upcoming review of the long-term financial plan, we need to take into consideration to return strategies, how and then you have to pay.
I mean, pay this item, what, didn't pay what?
And that pay plus.
overall himself.
Yeah.
Come on, that, that's perfect.
All right, we have the recommendation, the years of recommendation, that is great one. Move on. You say the motion, no. Did you second it? When they go.
Yeah, good.
You're right, thank you. So there's no items for discussion. No items for discussion for six meetings, no questions about those and no motions without those. So we'll call the meeting to close at 9:06.